Good morning. Welcome to today's story, a touching, humane, and educational tale.
The day she was left with the tide. The worst part of the storm wasn't the wind. It was the moment a grown man, one of the richest men in town, stood soaked to the bone inside that broken marina and realized the girl he had laughed at was the only reason his little granddaughter was still alive. That girl was Mara Collins, 18 years old, quiet as low tide, stubborn as driftwood wedged between rocks, and standing in a place everybody else had already given up on. This story will show you that being left behind does not mean your life is over, that broken places still hold value, and that sometimes the people the world dismisses are the very ones who learn how to save it. The morning Mara was left at the marina, the sky looked too wide for grief. That was the first thing she noticed. The second was how the gulls kept screaming over the water like nothing in the world had changed. Her uncle's truck idled beside the warped wooden gate for less than a minute, long enough for him to drag her duffel bag from the back seat, long enough to avoid looking directly at her. Then he set it down in the gravel. "There's nothing more I can do," he said. It was the kind of sentence adults use when they wanted to sound tired instead of guilty. Mara stood there in an oversized denim jacket that had once belonged to her mother, her dark hair pulled back, low and loose, one hand wrapped around the strap of her bag so tightly her knuckles looked bloodless. She did not beg. She did not ask where she was supposed to sleep. She did not ask what kind of man leaves his dead sister's daughter at the edge of a collapsing marina with $200, a folder of unpaid bills, in a building no one wanted. Maybe because she already knew the answer. People did what was easiest for them. Her uncle cleared his throat, glanced toward the water, then back at the road. "The property's in your mother's name, or what's left of it. Lawyer said it passes to you now. You can sell scrap, I guess. Stay a few days. Figure something out." Then after a pause that somehow made it worse, he added, "Mara, this town's not gonna save you." No, it wasn't. She watched his truck disappear up the narrow coast road until it turned past the bait shop and vanished behind the hill. The silence afterward felt bigger than the ocean. This was on the southern Oregon coast, in a town small enough that everybody knew your business and lonely enough that people pretended not to. Winlock Bay had once been the kind of place where working boats lined the docks before sunrise, and the diners stayed full of fishermen with rough hands and bad backs. But that had been years ago. The new commercial harbor 2 miles north had taken the money, the traffic, and most of the jobs with it. What stayed behind at the old marina was the stuff people didn't need anymore: rotting pilings, cracked windows, rusted engines, and memories too heavy to carry anywhere else. Mara turned toward the gate. The hand-painted sign that once read, "Collins Point Marina," hung crooked on one chain. The lettering faded and peeling under salt and time. One corner knocked softly against the post in the wind. Her mother used to bring her here on Sundays. That memory came so fast it almost hurt. Not the hospital room, not the coughing, not the last week with its paper cups and whispered updates and strangers pretending to be gentle. No, what hit Mara was a brighter memory. Her mother standing on the dock in a red raincoat, laughing with a coffee in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. Calling out tide times from memory, waving at crabbers heading out, showing Mara how to listen to the water against the posts and tell whether the weather was turning. Back then, the marina had felt alive. Back then, her mother had too. Mara opened the gate and stepped inside. The gravel path was cracked with weeds. The office windows were cloudy with salt. A bent fuel sign leaned sideways near a stack of lobster pots no one had touched in years. The bait freezer sat dead and empty beside the wall, lid half open like it had given up mid-breath. A sensible person would have seen ruin. Mara saw evidence. Not hope, not yet. Just evidence that people had once built something here because it mattered. She crossed the dock slowly, testing each board before putting her full weight down. The wood groaned beneath her sneakers. The smell of salt, diesel, wet rope, and old cedar rose up around her like a language she hadn't heard in years but still understood. At the end of the main walkway sat the old supply shed and office combined. A squat gray building with a patch roof and a porch sagging to one side. That apparently was home now. The key her uncle had given her stuck in the lock. She had to shove the door with her shoulder to get it open. Inside, the place was dim and cold and smelled like mildew, machine oil, and old paper. Dust coated the counter. A coffee mug still sat beside the register, stained dark at the bottom as if someone had meant to come back after lunch and never did. Against the far wall stood a narrow cot, a rusted space heater, and two shelves bowing under binders, tide charts, receipt books, and repair manuals. Mara set down her duffel bag and just stood there. For the first time all morning, her face changed. Not much. Just enough. Her mouth tightened. Her chin trembled once. Her eyes shone bright, then brighter. She pressed the heel of her hand against them before anything could fall. Outside, waves slapped the pilings in a steady rhythm. Inside, the quiet pressed in from every side. She could leave, she thought. Take the $200, walk up the road, find a bus station in the next county, sleep sitting up somewhere bright and anonymous. Start becoming the kind of person nobody could trace back to this place. Maybe that would be easier. Then she noticed the drawer beneath the counter. It was half jammed shut. She pulled it open. Inside were three tied notebooks, a ring of labeled keys, a waterproof flashlight, and one weathered spiral journal with her mother's name written across the front in blue ink. Lena Collins. Mara picked it up carefully, like something fragile enough to bruise. The first pages were filled with handwritten notes, tide shifts, fuel deliveries, docking fees, wind patterns, engine trouble for local boats. But farther in, the entries became more personal. Not diary entries exactly, more like observations. Which captains ignored bad water? Which months the current changed faster near the rocks? Which families were one broken engine away from losing everything? Mara turned another page, then another. The building around her was still broken. The bills in the folder were still real. She was still 18, still alone, still one bad week away from having nowhere at all. But as she stood there reading by the light coming through that dirty window, something inside her shifted. Just a little, not into confidence, not into certainty, into attention. Like her mother's voice was still somewhere in these pages, not asking to be mourned, but asking to be understood. By late afternoon, the wind had sharpened and the sky had gone silver over the bay. Down at the diner, people had probably already heard Mara Collins had been dumped at the old Marina, like one more unpaid problem nobody wanted. Some of them would say she'd be gone by Friday. Some would say the county would condemn the building before the month was out. Some would shrug and stir sugar into burnt coffee and say it was sad. Sure, but what could anybody do? Mara lit the flashlight when the office grew dim. Then she sat on the floor beside the counter with her mother's journal open across her knees, her duffel bag still unpacked, and the sound of the tide rising under the dock. Outside, the marina looked like the end of something. Inside, without telling a soul, Mara stayed. And somewhere, deep beneath the grief, beneath the silence, beneath the sting of being left behind, the first small piece of her was already refusing to leave with the rest of the world. A place no one believed could live again. Mara stayed through the first night by sleeping in her jacket on top of the cot, with one hand wrapped around the flashlight and the other tucked beneath her cheek like she was still trying to make herself smaller than the room. The wind rattled the loose siding until almost dawn. Somewhere out on the water, a buoy bell clanged through the dark at uneven intervals. By morning, the cold had settled into the walls. So had reality. Nothing had changed overnight. The bills were still stacked on the counter. The roof still leaked in one corner. The sink still coughed rust when she turned the handle. And Collins Point Marina was still one hard shove away from looking like it might slide straight into the bay. But Mara had made it through the night. That counted for something. She tied her hair back, rolled up the sleeves of her mother's old flannel, and started with the trash. Broken crates, waterlogged brochures, moldy life vests, a tackle box full of bent hooks and pennies. She worked in silence for hours, dragging junk into piles across the gravel, sweeping out the office, opening windows that had not been opened in years. Dust rose in the slanted morning light. Salt clung to everything. By noon, her shoulders ached. Her palms were scraped raw, and she had uncovered enough empty floor space to remind herself the building had once belonged to the living. Around 1 o'clock, a boy on a rusted bicycle slowed at the gate. He looked maybe 16. Skinny, sharp-faced, restless in the way teenage boys get when they've learned the whole world expects them to joke before anyone notices how closely they're paying attention. He coasted halfway in, one sneaker dragging over the gravel. "You actually staying here?" he asked. Mara leaned on the broom. "Looks like it." He squinted toward the office. "Thought they were tearing this place down. Not today." He gave a short laugh, not mean exactly, just surprised. "Town says it's dead." Mara looked past him at the dock, at the weathered posts standing stubborn against the tide. "Town says a lot of things." That made him grin. He nodded once, like he respected the answer more than he planned to, then jerked his thumb toward the road. I'm Eli. I run deliveries for Duffy's sometimes. If you need coffee, get there before 9. After that, it tastes like burnt tires. Then he pushed off and rode away. It was the first conversation Mara had had since her uncle left. It lingered with her longer than she expected. By the third day, people had started noticing she had not disappeared. That seemed to irritate some of them. From the office window, she could see pickup trucks slow just enough for drivers to stare. A pair of older men in rubber boots stood by the bait shop one morning and watched her haul rotten rope into a pile like they were witnessing a stray dog trying to build a church. Nobody offered help. Nobody needed to. People in towns like Winlock Bay had a way of telling you exactly where you stood without saying a word. Still, Mara kept working. She found 3 usable buckets, 6 dry towels, a heavy toolbox with more rust than shine, and an old hand-painted rate board listing fuel prices from nearly 5 years earlier. She found her mother's receipts tucked inside binders and tide charts folded into drawers. She found a stack of unpaid invoices that made her stomach sink. And she found beneath a tarp in the side shed a small outboard motor that looked ugly but not hopeless. That afternoon, while she was crouched beside it with a rag and a socket wrench, she heard boots on the dock. Heavy boots. Measured. No hurry in them. She looked up and saw a broad-shouldered man in a brown canvas coat standing at the edge of the shed. Early 60s, maybe. Gray beard. Baseball cap pulled low. Hands thick and scarred from work that did not happen behind desks. He took in the motor, the tools, the scattered parts. Then he looked at Mara. "You know what you're doing with that?" he asked. His tone was flat. Not mocking. Not friendly either. Mara wiped grease across her wrist. Not yet. Something in his face shifted. Not warmth, but maybe the smallest flicker of approval. "That one floods easy," he said. "Carburetor sticks. If you force it, you'll make it worse." Mara sat back on her heels. "You from around here?" He gave her a dry look. "Long enough to know when somebody's about to ruin a decent engine." That almost made her smile. Almost. He stepped closer, crouched beside the motor with the stiff care of a man whose knees no longer forgave him, and tapped one bolt with a thick finger. "Loosen that first, then clean the bowl before you touch the line." Mara watched carefully. He noticed that too. After a moment, he said, "Owen Pike." She nodded. "Mara Collins. I know who you are." There was no cruelty in it. Just fact. He rose slowly, dusted off his hands, and glanced out toward the marina. "Your mom knew this place better than most. Kept more folks afloat than they ever thanked her for." Mara looked down at the motor before he could see the way that landed. When she spoke, her voice came out quieter than she meant it to. "I found her notebooks." Owen gave one slow nod, then read them. That was all. No speech. No pity. No welcome to town kindness wrapped around a wound. Just read them. Then he turned and walked back up the dock like a man who had already said more than he preferred in one afternoon. That night, Mara sat at the counter with one of her mother's tied notebooks open beside a legal pad. She had begun making lists. What could be salvaged? What had to be thrown out? What the marina used to offer. Fuel, ice, basic engine checks, dock tie-ups, storm mooring, a place to wait out rough weather. She stared at that last one for a long time. A place to wait out rough weather. The new harbor up north had bigger slips and cleaner concrete and better money behind it. But it also charged more than most small fishing crews could spare. And it had forgotten something Collins Point had once understood. Working people did not always need polish. Sometimes they needed near. Sometimes they needed cheap. Sometimes they just needed somebody to leave a light on. The next morning, Mara carried a ladder out to the front post and rehung the old marina sign as straight as she could manage alone. The chain groaned. The wood swayed. But when she climbed down and stepped back, Collins Point Marina was visible from the road again. Faded. Crooked, weather-beaten, still there. A few minutes later, Eli rode past, slowed, and let out a low whistle. "Well," he said, grinning at the sign, "that's one way to make people talk." Mara looked up at the name her mother had kept alive for so many years. Then she looked out over the dock, the gray water, the peeling rails, the buildings everybody else had written off. For the first time since being left there, she did not see only what was broken. She saw what the place had once been. And more dangerous than that, she saw what it might still become. When the water changed, she was the only one watching. By the second week, Mara had started noticing things other people no longer bothered to see. The tide at Collins Point did not just rise and fall. It shifted in temperament. Some mornings the water came in quiet, almost polite, sliding beneath the docks with a soft, familiar hush. Other days it moved with a restless kind of force, pushing harder against the pilings, curling strange eddies where the channel narrowed near the rocks. Mara had her mother's notebooks open almost every night now. She read them by flashlight when the office lamp flickered. Wind patterns, moon pull, tide swings, the way weather could look ordinary right up until the hour it turned dangerous. At first, she was only trying to understand the marina. Then she began to understand something else. The bay was changing faster than the forecasts were saying. One Wednesday morning, she stood at the end of the dock with her jacket zipped to her chin and watched the surface of the water twitch under a hard east wind. That was wrong. Not impossible. Just wrong enough to bother her. She went back inside, pulled 3 of Lena's notebooks into a stack, and started comparing dates, wind notes, and tide behavior from past storms. The more she read, the tighter her chest felt. By noon, she had written the same thought 3 different ways on the edge of a legal pad. If the wind swings south after dark, the North Harbor will take the hit sideways. The new harbor sat exposed in all the ways Collins Point didn't. It looked modern, stronger, better funded, but it had been built for convenience, not memory. For investors, not old watermen. Mara knew how that sounded, even inside her own head. Too dramatic, too certain, too much like the kind of person people rolled their eyes at. Still, she could not shake it. That afternoon, she walked up to Duffy's Market and used the payphone by the ice machine to call 2 local boat owners whose names she had found in her mother's notes. One did not answer. The other did. Marty Jensen. Hi, this is Mara Collins from Collins Point. A pause. Then Lena's girl? Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Another pause, softer this time. What do you need? Mara tightened her grip on the receiver. I think the water may turn rough tonight. Rougher than forecast. If you've got gear tied up at North Harbor, you may want to double-check your lines before dark. Silence. Not rude silence. Worse. Careful silence. Finally, he said, weather report says light coastal storm. I know. You a meteorologist now? No, sir. That stung more than it should have. She looked out through the market window at the gray sky gathering over town. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing. Marty let out a breath through his nose. I appreciate the call, he said, in the kind tone people use when they're humoring grief, youth, or both. Take care now. Then he hung up. Mara stood there with the receiver still against her ear for a second longer than necessary before placing it back in the cradle. By evening, the clouds had lowered. The gulls flew inland. The air smelled metallic, like rain, and something sharper underneath it. Eli came by on his bike carrying a paper sack with 2 sandwiches from Tess Rowan at the clinic. She said you look like somebody who keeps forgetting meals, he announced, handing it over. Mara gave him half a smile. She always this direct? Pretty much. He leaned his bike against the porch rail and studied her face. You look worried. Mara glanced toward the bay. I think the storm's going to hit different than people expect. Eli followed her gaze. Bad different? Maybe. He nodded slowly, the grin fading off him for once. You telling people? Tried. And? Mara gave a quiet shrug. He kicked at a loose board with the toe of his sneaker. Town doesn't listen fast, you probably noticed. That almost made her laugh. Almost. Later that night, she made the mistake of going into Harlan's diner. She only wanted coffee, maybe a few minutes under warm lights, around ordinary sounds. But the second she stepped inside, she felt it. That subtle shift in a room when conversation bends around a person instead of toward them. At the back booth, Grant Holloway sat with 2 men from the harbor office. He was clean-shaven, broad-shouldered, dressed in the kind of expensive coastal workwear that looked rugged without ever having seen real strain. He spotted her before she could turn away. Well, he said, not loudly, but with enough weight that half the diner heard it anyway. If it isn't the new dockmaster of the Ghost Marina. A few people chuckled. Not cruelly, maybe, but not kindly either. Mara kept walking toward the counter. Grant wasn't done. Heard you've been calling around with storm warnings, he said. That true? She stopped. Every instinct told her to keep moving. Instead, she turned. I told a couple people to check their lines, that's all. Grant smiled the way men smile when they are already enjoying your embarrassment. Based on what, a hunch? Heat crept up Mara's neck. Based on tide records, wind shift, current patterns. This time the laughter was a little louder. Grant leaned back in the booth, one arm stretched along the seat. With all due respect, sweetheart, the coast doesn't hand out expertise because somebody found a notebook. The word sweetheart landed harder than the laughter. Mara felt every eye in the room, felt the old instinct rise. The one that says make yourself smaller, quieter, easier to dismiss. For one terrible second, she almost obeyed it. Then she saw Tess near the pie case watching, not rescuing her, just watching, as if waiting to see whether Mara would stand by her own words. So Mara did. Her voice came out low but steady. Maybe not, but the water doesn't care what anybody calls me. The diner went still. Grant's smile thinned. Mara turned, set $2 on the counter for coffee she no longer wanted, and walked back out into the wind before the room could swallow her pride whole. By the time she reached Collins Point, her hands were shaking. Not from cold, from humiliation, from anger, from that awful private kind of doubt that comes after people laugh at you in public. Inside the office, she shut the door, leaned against it, and stared at her mother's notebook spread across the counter. For the first time since she arrived, she wondered if everybody else was right. Maybe she was just a grieving girl trying to hear wisdom in old pages, because losing that voice for good felt unbearable. Maybe this place was dead. Maybe she was the only fool still talking to it. A knock sounded against the frame. Owen Pike stood outside, cap damp with mist, coat collar turned up against the wind. He stepped in without ceremony, glanced once at her face, then at the notes on the counter. "You tie down the east cleats yet?" he asked. Mara frowned. "No." "Then do that first." She stared at him. "You think it's coming in hard, too?" Owen looked out toward the blackening water. "I think people who still watch with their own eyes ought to trust what they see." That was all. No comfort dressed up as poetry. No speech to stitch her back together. Just something solid enough to stand on. An hour later, Tess arrived with a first aid kit and extra blankets. Eli came after that with batteries, 3 flashlights, and a face trying hard to look less scared than he was. No one said Mara had been right. Not yet, but they stayed. And as the light drained out of the sky, Mara moved through the marina, switching on the backup lanterns she had cleaned, checking ropes, clearing the shed, making space. The wind rose. The water darkened. Somewhere far out in the bay, a buoy bell began to clang in sharp, uneven bursts. Mara stopped at the end of the dock and looked toward the North Harbor, where lights still glimmered in the distance, like people clinging to certainty. Then she looked back at Collins Point. Old wood, salt-stained rails, faded signs, a place everybody had written off. She drew in one slow breath and pulled her jacket tighter. She still did not know whether anyone would come, but she knew this much. If the storm turned the way she feared, Collins Point would not be dark when it did. The storm did not arrive all at once. It built itself in layers. First the wind sharpened, then the rain came sideways. Then the whole bay seemed to pull one long, furious breath and throw itself against the shore. By 8 o'clock, Collins Point was already groaning under it. The dock chains snapped tight, then shuddered. Loose metal clattered somewhere behind the fuel shed. Water slapped hard beneath the pilings, no longer sounding like tide, but like force. Mara stood in the office doorway with her hood up, one hand wrapped around a lantern, watching the darkness move. Not empty darkness, working darkness, shifting, rising, alive. Inside, Tess was laying blankets across the cot and clearing space on the counter for bandages and antiseptic. Eli was on his knees sorting batteries with trembling fingers, trying very hard to look useful instead of scared. Owen had gone out twice already to double-check the storm lines and came back soaked both times, saying almost nothing. That worried Mara more than if he had cursed. Owen Pike was the kind of man who only got quiet when things were worse than he wanted to say. At 8:17, the first truck came. Its headlights swung wild across the gravel before cutting out near the gate. A fisherman Mara recognized only vaguely stumbled out into the rain with his wife behind him and a little boy half asleep against her shoulder. The man yelled over the wind that the North Harbor had lost power on the east side and one of the outer slips had broken loose. Mara did not waste time asking questions. She pointed Tess toward the family, handed the man a dry towel, and told Eli to start another lantern. 10 minutes later, 2 more people arrived. Then 4. Then a pair of deckhands dragging one limping man between them. The storm had turned exactly the way Mara feared. The water had shifted hard against the North Harbor, pushing sideways through the open angle of the slips. Boats knocked against one another. Lines failed. People who had trusted clean concrete and newer wood were now fighting current and panic in the dark. At Collins Point, the old marina everybody had dismissed was doing what it had always done best. Holding, not perfectly, not beautifully, but holding, because it sat tucked into the curve of the bay. Because the break in the rocks off the south edge softened the worst of the surge, Because the old dock had been built by people who respected bad water instead of trying to impress good investors. And because Mara had spent the last week tightening what she could, clearing what she could, and leaving light where she could. At 8:46, somebody started pounding on the side door of the shed. Mara opened it and nearly stepped back. Grant Holloway stood there in a rain-slick jacket, one arm wrapped around a girl no older than 7 or 8. The child's face was buried against his chest. Two of his workers were behind him, bent low against the wind. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Grant looked at Mara with rain running down his face and all the polished confidence stripped clean off him. "The road by the storage yard is flooding," he said, breathless. "We couldn't get back uphill." Mara looked at the girl. Her sneakers were soaked. Her lips had gone pale. This, she thought, was the moment that decided what kind of person pain had made her. She could have remembered the diner, the laughter, the word sweetheart. She could have let that memory harden her. Instead, she stepped aside and held the door wider. "Get inside," she said. Grant did not argue. Neither did pride. The next hour blurred into motion. Mara tied ropes with Owen under a sky that seemed determined to tear itself apart. She helped guide two skidding skiffs into the lee side of the dock, where the water ran calmer. She held a flashlight in her teeth while Eli passed up spare cleats, an old float line from the supply shed. She ran dripping blankets back to Tess, who was working through a growing line of cuts, bruises, and one deep gash across a shrimper's forearm. No one had to appoint Mara in charge. The night did it for them, because she knew where everything was, because she did not freeze, because while other people were still reacting, she had already been preparing. Near 10 o'clock, one of the side gates tore loose with a crack that cut through the storm. Eli flinched. Tess looked up. Someone in the room started crying. Mara's heart kicked hard against her ribs, but her voice stayed steady. "Stay back from the windows," she called. "Lanterns away from the curtains. Owen, with me?" They fought the gate in waist-deep spray and hammering wind, wrestling it back with rope and a boat hook while the dock pitched beneath them. Mara's hands burned. Her shoulders screamed. Twice she nearly lost her footing. But then Owen got the line around the piling. Mara pulled. The knot caught, and the broken gate held. Barely, but long enough. When they stumbled back inside, soaked through and breathing hard, the room had changed. Not because the storm was over. It wasn't. Not because people were calm. They weren't. It had changed because everyone in that marina now understood the same thing. This place was not a ruin tonight. It was the reason they were still dry enough to shiver, warm enough to wait, alive enough to hope for morning. Close to midnight, the power went out across the far shoreline completely. The bay beyond Collins Point disappeared into black. Only the lanterns remained, gold circles trembling against old wood, faces lined with fear, hands wrapped around tin mugs. Tess checking pulses. Eli half asleep upright in a chair, still holding a flashlight. Grant sitting beside his granddaughter in silence, one hand over hers like he no longer trusted the world to keep anything safe unless he touched it himself. Mara stood at the office window, rainwater cooling on the back of her neck, and looked out at the marina. The sign was still there. The dock was still there. The lights were still there. Everybody had called Collins Point dead, but dead things did not fight this hard to keep breathing. And somewhere in the roar of wind and water, with her mother's notebook stacked behind her and a room full of people depending on a place they once laughed at, Mara realized the marina was not the only thing still standing. Neither was she. What she saved was more than a marina. By morning, the storm had moved north. Not gone, not harmless, but no longer tearing straight through Winlock Bay. The rain had softened to a cold mist. The wind still pressed hard off the water, but the wildness had broken. And in that pale, washed-out light of early morning, people began to see what the night had really done. The North Harbor was damaged bad. A row of slips had splintered. Two small boats sat half-collapsed against each other like tired animals that had fought too long to stay upright. The road near the storage yard was underwater in places, littered with driftwood, tangled rope, and pieces of broken dock. But Collins Point Marina was still standing, battered, soaked, shaking in places, but standing. Mara stepped out onto the dock with a blanket still around her shoulders and looked over the water. Everything smelled like wet cedar, diesel, salt, and storm mud. Behind her, the people who had taken shelter there moved slowly now, speaking in low voices, helping each other gather coats, check trucks, and count what had survived. No one laughed at the marina that morning. No one called it dead. Grant Holloway came out just after sunrise, his granddaughter's small hand still wrapped around two of his fingers. He stopped a few feet from Mara. For once, there was no polished smile on his face, no audience either, just the two of them, the broken weather and the truth sitting between them. She'd be dead if we hadn't made it here, he said quietly, glancing down at the little girl. Mara did not answer right away. Grant looked out across the dock, then back at her. I was wrong about you, he said. About this place, too. The apology was plain, not dramatic, which somehow made it feel more real. Mara looked at the child, then at the bent railing, the lantern still burning low in the office window, the wet boards that had held through the worst of it. This place was built to protect people, she said. Folks just forgot. Grant nodded once. A few days later, after the roads cleared and the town had time to breathe again, he came back with an offer. It was more money than Mara had ever seen attached to her name. Enough to leave. Enough to rent an apartment inland, buy a decent used car, maybe even start over somewhere nobody knew how she had been left behind. Grant told her he wanted to buy Collins Point, restore the location, modernize it, make it profitable. Maybe on another day, another version of Mara would have taken the check just to prove she could. But the storm had changed something deeper than her circumstances. It had shown her what Collins Point really was. Not a scrap property, not a burden, not the last broken thing her mother left behind. It was a refuge, a working place, a stubborn piece of shoreline that still knew how to serve the people no one else planned around. So Mara told him no, not angrily, not triumphantly, just clearly. And that no was the strongest thing she had said in her whole life. What happened after that was not magic. It was slower than magic. Better, too. Owen started coming by most mornings, pretending he was only there to keep her from ruining decent equipment. Tess helped organize emergency supplies and labeled bins inside the office. Eli painted a new sign for the front gate, getting blue paint on his hands, his jeans, and somehow the side of his neck. A few fishermen came back, then a few more. Some needed engine work. Some needed cheap tie-up space. Some just needed a place where somebody still understood the difference between a person being poor and a person being worthless. By the end of the season, Collins Point was no longer just surviving. It was serving. Mara kept one shelf in the office for storm blankets, first aid kits, batteries, and bottled water. She turned the back room into a simple bunk space for deckhands stranded overnight in rough weather. And on the wall behind the counter, beside the tide charts and keys, she placed her mother's weathered notebook where she could see it every day. Not like a relic, like a foundation. One evening, long after the storm had passed into town memory and been retold enough times to become legend, Mara stood by the dock as the sun dropped low over the bay. The new sign creaked gently above her. Collins Point Marina, fresh paint. Old name, true purpose. The water moved calmer now, gold at the edges. Behind her, Owen was muttering about a fuel line. Tess was laughing at something Eli said. And for the first time in a long, long while, Mara did not feel like someone who had been abandoned. She felt like someone who had built a place where abandonment stopped. So let me ask you something. Have you ever been written off by people who only saw your broken season and not the strength you were building underneath it? Sometimes the world looks at an old dock, an old dream, or a hurting person and says, there's nothing left there. But sometimes that's exactly where the light stays on. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel. Stay with us for more powerful stories of resilience, hope, and second chances. And share in the comments where you're watching from and what part of Mara's journey stayed with you the most.